Hi everyone. We've all heard of the news earlier this month about what seems to be a takeover of Venezuela by the United States. This brings me to examine a central question to current global affairs, which is to do with interventionism and the agenda behind peace negotiation. When peace is promised by powerful actors, what is really being negotiated and at what cost? This question has become especially urgent in light of recent developments involving the United States, namely, as I said, their recent intervention in Venezuela, the Washington Accords, which cement the brokering of peace in eastern DR Congo, and the negotiations around Ukraine that are tied to access to rare earth minerals. Together, these cases are not isolated and instead reveal a broader pattern in how peace is being framed and, to be blunt, is being instrumentalized. To make sense of this, it helps to think of interventionism as a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, we find interventions that are relatively selfless, or at least broadly aligned with multilateral legitimacy, the restoration of political order, and the consent or protection of civilian populations. One example of this is Haiti in 1994, where the US intervened with international backing to restore an elected president following a coup. The intervention was limited in scope and framed around democratic restoration. It was imperfect for sure, but closer to the selfless end of the spectrum. On the other end, we find interventions that are openly opportunistic, driven primarily by strategic advantage, access to resources, geopolitical leverage, or domestic political gain. And one prime example of this is Iraq in 2003. Here, intervention was justified through claims of security threats and moral necessity that later collapsed when weapons of mass destruction were never found and were essentially a hoax. The outcome was prolonged instability in the region and immense human costs. This sits far closer to the opportunistic end of the spectrum. Most real-world interventions fall somewhere in between. Very few are purely altruistic, very few are entirely cynical, but the position on the spectrum matters because it shapes legitimacy, durability, and trust in the peace-building process. So these two examples, the example of Haiti in 1994 and the one of Iraq in 2003, show that interventionism spans a wide continuum and that outcomes tend to worsen as interventions slide toward coercion, deception, and unilateralism. At this point, it's important to be clear. What we are witnessing today is not a sudden moral collapse in international politics. Very little of this opportunistic interventionism is new, but the degree of explicitness is. Historically, military and diplomatic interventions by great powers, especially the United States, have almost always mixed moral language with strategic, economic, or geopolitical interests. From interventions during the Cold War era that were justified as containing communism, to humanitarian interventions after the Cold War era, which were framed around democracy promotion or human rights. Altruism on one side and self-interest on the other side have been deeply intertwined. Access to resources, regional influence, alliance politics, and domestic political considerations have consistently shaped decisions to intervene or not. This history matters because it gives us a baseline for comparison. What makes Donald Trump different and why it matters? Trump has often presented himself as a deal maker, someone who can end wars by cutting through diplomatic complexity. However, Trump does not simply sit on the opportunistic side of the spectrum, he stretches it and in some cases steps off it entirely. What distinguishes Trump's approach, which has been termed the Donroe Doctrine, is not the presence of self-interest, but the abandonment of legitimizing norms. Previous administrations, even when acting opportunistically, typically used multilateral institutions, they appeal to international law, or at least maintain a certain degree of rhetorical commitment to global norms. Trump largely discards this. His worldview strips away the veneer. Peace, security guarantees, and diplomatic engagement are treated openly as commodities in exchange for tangible returns. We see this clearly in Ukraine. Peace negotiations have been explicitly linked to US access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals that are essential for technology, defense, and energy transitions. peace in this framing becomes a deal. The peace deal between DR Congo and Rwanda offers an ambiguous case. After decades of violence, it goes without saying that any step toward peace matters deeply. Yet it's important to note that Eastern Congo is also central to global supply chains for cobalt and coltan, which are resources critical to modern economies. Therefore, the question is not whether peace is welcome, it is whether peace is being shaped primarily as a political process for the Congolese people or as a stabilization mechanism for external interests. That distinction will determine whether peace lasts. The case of Venezuela takes this a step further. Here, the issue is not only opportunism, but deception. Deception toward Venezuelans who are promised liberation, deception toward Americans who didn't vote for arbitrary intervention outside their borders and are offered simplified narratives, and deception toward the international community who is presented with shifting justifications between anti-narcotics enforcement, democratic restoration, regional security. The rationale changes depending on the audience, all while international law is not only overlooked, but undermined. When the president of a sovereign country and members of his family are suddenly captured and extradited, when the United States seizes control of all resources in Venezuela, and when the president of the United States openly casts himself as the acting president of Venezuela, this is no longer merely sliding along the spectrum. This is operating outside of it. And when peace or stability is pursued through deception, trust collapses before peace can even begin. And this brings us to the heart of the argument. When peace is reduced to a bargaining chip rather than a political process, it undermines local legitimacy, durability, and the very idea that peace is something to be built rather than bought. Transactional peace is fragile as it lasts only as long as interests are aligned. Peace as a process, that means slow, inclusive, and politically intentional, is harder but far more resilient and sustainable. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If peace is negotiated primarily for strategic gain, who does it ultimately serve and how long can it last? Peace can sit anywhere on the spectrum, but once it slips into pure transaction or outright deception, I believe it stops being peace in any meaningful sense. What do you think? Thank you for watching the Peace Compass. If this resonated, then please like, comment, and share. Till the next video, goodbye.